with God. but Job says, I want to have this court case, and God gives it to him. God
Right.
responds to Job how he asks, which is pretty amazing. And I think that's how it is in our life, and that's how it's been for me too, with when it's only happened like a couple times in my life, but it was the most transformative times in my life, when I had to basically either cry out or ask God the thing, and it took forever to figure out what my question was.
Yes.
That took years. Like, I didn't know what I wanted or what my question was, but then when I was able to formulate it, like, God had an answer for me,
Right.
and it wasn't the answer that I expected. That's how I know it was beyond me, and it was
Right.
a surprise, and it took me back, and like sort of it was transformative. So I think that's what we have to do, and a lot of times, like, I think the reason why Job suffers is because suffering is the most clearest sort of example of that. When you have a child that's sick, or when you are suffering yourself of, illness or just circumstance or whatever, you have a lot of questions for God about that. And the correct stance is to ask the questions. Well, first figure out what the questions are, and then ask them to him.
Right. Well, that's high contrast. Suffering is high contrast, right? I would say life is struggle. Suffering is inevitable, right? And you can turn struggle into joy or more suffering. But you do that. The world doesn't do that to you. You do that. Job is an example of that, right? Like, he's turning his struggle into as much joy as he can manage, and maybe it's not much joy, right? But and then I like what you said, because this is also something. All right, welcome everybody. I'm on the road, and I have a special guest, Jess, who has graciously taken some time out of his busy workday, because he apparently works all the time, to talk to me about wisdom, and particularly the Book of Job, because that's his area of expertise. And I know experts aren't like the big thing now, but also you kind of need experts. So I consider Jess an expert. We've talked to him before about the Book of Job, although not publicly. But this time we really want to talk about wisdom. So kind of my recollection is there was some chatter on Twitter about wisdom, and I was like, I really struggle with wisdom because I haven't heard a really good comprehensive definition. I've heard good sort of, this is definitely part of wisdom, and that's definitely part of wisdom, but nothing sort of comprehensive. And so that sort of spawned this talk. Is Jess was like, well, they say stuff about wisdom in the Book of Job, and then of course Jess, being the wonderful expert that he is, actually did a bunch of research for us, which is good because then I don't have to. And so he's gonna expound on that. So Jess, you want to give a little more background, and then we'll jump right into it.
Yeah, well, I was thinking we could start off just talking about Vervaeke, because that seems to be a common thing that we can have, and to kind of launch this off, because I've kind of had a bone to pick with Vervaeke about this, and sort of more in general with Peterson as well, but he doesn't talk too much about wisdom. But for Vervaeke, I went back and tried to get some kind of definition of what he considers wisdom to be, and he, I think very simply, this is how I understand it, wisdom is there to ameliorate foolishness and enhance connectedness. So when he talks about ameliorating foolishness, he's talking about self-destructive and self-deceptive behavior. So he talks at length about self-deception. Self-destruction is kind of almost sort of self-evident. It would be anything that you fall into addiction or some sort of fixation that doesn't enhance the rest of your life but starts destroying it. Self-deception is a little bit more nuanced, and you probably know more about Vervaeke's thought than I do, Mark, so chime in whenever you have an idea. But when he talks about self-deception, he's talking about our own ability to pay attention to the world, interpret the patterns of the world, and try to determine the best way to act sometimes those mental maps will get us stuck into a certain frame, and then we won't be able to actually respond correctly because we're stuck in some sort of frame. And this is what I think he would call self-deception. So you can fall into a self-deceptive mode of action or mode of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that there's different camps, right? And so there's the beauty will save the world camp.
Mm-hmm.
There's the truth will save the world camp, which is a tricky one because then you get in this what is truth, right? You get the same thing with beauty, but we haven't gotten that far with beauty. Most people go, oh yeah, definitely, right? But with truth, everybody goes, yeah, but who checks the fact checkers, right? They go there immediately.
Which truths, which facts?
Right, we've been through this already. Right. In other words, we've already tried to rely on truth, and it hasn't, right? And then there's a bunch of other people like politics will save the world, economics will save the world, right? You see all these frames, but I think for Peterson, but certainly for John Vervaeke, who's in the Peterson sphere, obviously like we are, which is why this is why we all got together to some extent. Is Peterson through John, basically, right? And so. His thing is wisdom, both of them, I think, because I would argue logic, reason, rationality have failed in some sense. Those are the scientific endeavors, right? And so they've failed. And so their magic go-to silver bullet is called wisdom. And this is why we don't, I think, have a good definition, is because my magic bullet is called wisdom. What is that? Oh, okay. Because you get into the problem with truth and beauty. What is truth? What is beauty, right? Or what is true is a better way to say it, not truth. Mm-hmm. True. What is beauty? What is wisdom? And everybody falls into the trap. And I know John actually fell into this trap, which it really did make me cry at the time. He was advertising as after Socrates, and he did Socrates said, I'm wise because I know what I know that I know nothing, right? Which is a complete misquote. Like, it's just wrong. Like, I don't even know what else to say. It's so wrong. You can't describe how wrong it is. And I think that's actually important, right? It's an important sort of jumping off point. So what happened is Socrates is coming back from the Oracle of Delphi, and he's just heard some news that is actually disturbing to Socrates. Good news for a narcissist, but Socrates is not a narcissist. So the news is that he's the wisest person in Greece. And he's like, well, I mean, I know it's the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle of Delphi is not wrong because the Oracle of Delphi. But also, I'm kind of doubting the Oracle of Delphi at this point. He's kind of like, this is a little sus, right? And he's walking with this guy, right, who's also seen the Oracle of Delphi. And the guy's just, it's going on and on. And Socrates is, of course, listening very carefully, which I would say is part of wisdom, the ability to listen very carefully, right? Because this is one of the things you alluded to is, and John does talk about this, like you get stuck. Yeah, you get stuck in your own perspective, right? What's the way out? It's not wisdom from inside, right? Mm-hmm. It's stuff coming at you from outside, right? Or probably just because I know that you're in this, what do you, I've got an allergy to the word Christianity now, Christian. Yeah. Being a Christian, I don't like that. You're sort of more in the Cathodox sphere of emanation, where revelation comes down upon you from above, and maybe bursts out of you, but it comes down upon. It's imposed upon you from above, and that may feel like it's inside you, but no. And I think that's the key. Like, yes, something has to break through to you. And then you have to manifest. This is 2 steps. Well, it's really 3, because there's some sort of acknowledgement or confession or submission to it, right? In order for you to get unstuck from your perspective. Mm-hmm. And there's the message nobody wants to hear. So that's part of wisdom, is being open to how you're wrong, how you're stuck in your perspective in general, and listening to other perspectives, and realizing there are other perspectives, and maybe they have something valuable for you, even if most of the other perspective could be wrong, or it could completely overlap with yours except for one thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's wisdom, is knowing, oh, that one thing is important or it's garbage. We need to throw it out. And knowledge, logic, reason, and rationality can't do that. that'll be part of my argument. And so Socrates is realizing as he's listening to this guy that this guy's talking about things he doesn't know. He's pretending as though he does. And that's my definition of arrogance, by the way. Might be not other people's definition. People seem to confuse confidence and arrogance lately. I actually have a video on that, of course, on navigating patterns. Just saying. I'll try to remember to link it here. So people get confused very easily. But then what Socrates says is, well, I know what I know and what I don't know. Right. And that's what makes me wise. That's what makes me different from this man. And so maybe I am wise. Still a little skeptical on the wisest, right? But he's like, well, at least I know what I know when I know something and when I don't know something, right? And so that might give you an air of confidence, right? And Socrates is often accused of arrogance. Didn't I just talk about that? Yeah, So, and I think that's the problem, right? But that led me to sort of my very partial, very tiny definition of wisdom, which is part of wisdom is knowing what you know and knowing how little that is. So I don't know what you think of that, or if you want to
think that's good because if we're like to just use Vervaeke's definition, if we're to ameliorate foolishness and self-deception, you first have to admit that you don't know something.
Yep.
You have to be open to the thing that you don't know, and and so this is where John gets into his practices and stuff. So what you do is you cultivate practices that enable some opening up a way to take on different perspectives or different frames to move up and down the salience hierarchy or whatever you call it. And basically the practices are just moving out of perspectives, both higher and lower, as well as outside yourself and to inside yourself, in order to you're trying to be less self-deceptive and less foolish, we'll say. And then, but this also ties into so that's kind of like the negative aspect of it, but the positive aspect is to enhance connectedness. And I think that's the type of thing you're trying to connect to. You're trying to connect to other people. So like with Socrates, he's dialoguing, even though he's wiser and these people are kind of sometimes idiots, he still dialogues with them and he gets somewhere. And there's something that happens in the dialogue that can only happen in a dialogue. It doesn't happen in Socrates' head and then he writes it down. It happens in the dialogue. So so the connectedness both to each other, but also to maybe the transcendent or even that which is below you, to your dog or something, to the earth, as well as to angels or spirits or God himself.
Well, that's a very good point. So I want to go through a couple of things because you kind of went over a lot there. Maybe you don't realize how much you went over. So, as an actual expert in Vervaeke's practices, I will say, dead on. I think the problem with there's not a problem with it. The incompleteness in what you said is the practices have to be about getting in a new perspective, so adopting it, right? But also noticing that perspective, right? And then the third component is integrating that perspective, right? And then that allows you to make these connections. Now, those different perspectives are, and not just horizontal, there are some that are, and that's important, you need that, but they're also vertical. And this is where vertical causality comes in. And I think this is where the confusion is. People are sort of substituting the horizontal for the vertical. And the vertical is all about hierarchy. That's something that Jordan Peterson talks about quite a bit, right? And I think that's Peugeot. Super important. Huh?
Peugeot, right?
Yeah. Peugeot talks about that too. Yeah. All the religious people weirdly seem to talk about hierarchy. I don't know. It must be a random coincidence. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with proper reality as seen through distributed cognition over time of thousands of years.
Right.
It couldn't be that. I'm sure it's just a random coincidence. Might be a hint. So when you add those components together, so more perspective sort of at your level, if you will, and more perspective sort of above and, to your excellent point, below you, that's how you get more connected to the world. And then I want to tie this back to Plato's Republic, because I can, and this is still one of my bugaboos. And this is what book 7 is about. Book 7 has in the very beginning the allegory of the cave. See my video, like really, the Lives of Plato's Cave video is excellent. It really is. It's super important. But book 7 in general is about this idea that these people are going up and up and up towards the good, right? According to Plato, the good. Like this is the guy who talks about the good. Like this is the man, right? Through Socrates, by the way. Yeah, Socrates narrates the Republic, right? To some extent, right? He's the guy. And you pull them from the good, right? And Glaucon objects. He says, well, you can't do that. They're going towards the good, and that's good for them. And what's good for them is good for everybody. And Socrates goes, no. Remember, and he does this many times in the Republic, which is just hysterical to me. We're here for the city. We're not here for the person. We're here for the good of the city. And so what happens? They drag the guy down to the bottom of the city, to the lowest layer of the city. That's what the cave is about. The cave is about there are classes in society, and you can't get around that. And if you did, the world would end, basically. It wouldn't work. It's a basic thesis of the cave. Everybody misreads it, but that's actually what the text says. I've read it now. I have the goods. They're in my video. I've got all the little references right there. So if you don't believe me, you can watch the video and then try to disagree with me, and that'll be fine. When they drag him down, though, he makes suggestions to improve the city, right? The bottom layer of the city, which is really important because everything, I don't know if you know this, Jess, everything rests upon its base. Who knew? Foundations end up being important, and they stultify and they degrade, right? And so you need the top to come like all the way down, right? And then fix them. Like it just turns out to be a better way to go, like in the universe, in the real place in which we coexist, right? And so, but when you do that as the philosopher, the true philosopher, because sophists are evil and they pretend to be philosophers. The Republic is a hysterical book, by the way. If you didn't get the joke, you really missed it. It's quite funny. There are no accolades for them. No cheering, no. They get jeered at. What do you mean we have to change this and that and the other thing? And then the implication is, I don't think this is actually in text. The implication is some of those changes are made grudgingly, right? But no acknowledgement is ever given to the guy who said, "Hey, you got to change this, you got to change that, you can change that," right? And fair enough, like he's not doing the changing either. So you're not doing the work, dude. But also the work couldn't have been done without his perspective. Right. So his actual perspective is super important at the same time.
That's interesting.
But that's the proper relationship to the highest and the lowest.
Right. Yeah. And so, okay. So, this brings us kind of into transformation, because you need some sort of, if you're, let's say you're stuck in what is this? You're stuck in a place because your worldview is like not right. So you're in some sort of reciprocal self-deception of some kind that's actually like not addressing problems correctly in the world, and so you have to get out of it. And so you have to actually become something else in order to address that. And so it's that there's a transformational process that happens. I think that's where Vervaeke talks about, but I can't really get him. I don't know enough about him to know what he means by transformation. So do you know?
Right.
Do you know what he means?
No definition.
Okay. So, but I mean, we can just go with like, it's just from one thing to another. Like you going from a child to adulthood, you transform,
Sure.
And there's a transformational period, and that's kind of wrought with all kinds of problems as you navigate between those two. And this is why we have initiation rites, or why initiation rites are actually beneficial to people, because it marks a boundary where you can move from one to the other without, being stuck in ambiguity forever, all that stuff. So, okay, do you have any more thoughts? I kind of want to move into the wisdom literature in the Bible, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just flesh this out just a tad. So what I want to say is, yeah, everybody talks about transformation. Nobody defines it. Everybody talks about transformation as just being good in general, and that can't be true,
Right.
right? So, no.
You couldn't
And
possibly
so
transform into something worse.
right. Well, and that's what people miss. And then I have a video on the lie of progressivism, right? The lie of progress, and that's what that's wrapped up in. Is that
Oh, right.
you can make progress and it can be bad. Development is not always good.
Right.
Progress is not always good. It kind of depends where you're going and what and how you're getting there too, which is super important because one of the arguments I've made elsewhere is basically that what happens is you can get into a meditation practice, a private meditation practice. And what that will do is make you worse, because it will get you, and this is one of the things I wanted to sort of flesh out, stuck in your perspective. Right. And so maybe your perspective isn't getting worse. Maybe your perspective isn't reciprocal at all. Maybe it's just stuck, stultified, not moving. Okay. So in some ways, things that aren't moving are dead. And maybe that's part of the issue that people aren't addressing, is that it's not always a bad movement, right? Sometimes it's just the lack of movement as such that's sort of causing a problem, or is keeping you held where you are.
Right.
And maybe the solution is any movement, even in a bad direction or towards a bad aim, because I tend to talk about orientation, not direction.
You can't steer a ship that's parked. You got
right, but because Peterson talks about this, right? He talks about, oh, there's a star up here, and you move, and now the star's over here, and you're like, oh, no, I wanted to get closer to the star, right? But that tells you something, because you need contrast to see, right? So you have to contrast where you were with where you are with where the star is. Right? 3 things, by the way, 3 very important. You need 3. Direction only contains 2 components. Can't be the answer to anything, except movement as such, right? So if you can use direction to sense, oh, I'm not moving. That's bad. Something is dead, right? And okay, good. So some movement is better than no movement, but you still have to check the movement. And this is where I get, yes, and transformation doesn't do that. It just says you're going to transform or transcend or whatever. It doesn't say if it's good or bad, and that's super important. And maybe you can't do that, because maybe the third perspective that you need is one that isn't yours. So it's somebody else, right? And so I do this all the time. I know no one's going to believe me. I do this all the time, right? I get feedback from people that tell me, no, the direction you're moving in is not good, or your aim is off, right? Or you made a movement, and I don't think that movement did what you think it did, which is, they may not make a judgment on it. They may not say it's good or bad. It's just like, it sounds like you said you wanted to move more towards the star and you didn't quite manage that. Don't know what that means. Fair, right? These are super valuable people. This is why Manuel Post is so useful, because he will give you very neutral sounding feedback when needed. And sometimes he gives you negative feedback when you right. And maybe neither of us gives enough positive feedback. Could be. That might be what everyone's bitching about. Who knows? But I'm not a fan of positive feedback. I'm a big fan of negative feedback. So I just wanted to flesh that out. Like, sometimes you're just stuck. Like, you're not moving, but you are definitely just kind of stuck. And it's not a bad transformation or a reciprocal thing, right? It's just the lack of movement altogether. I think adding that nuance is important, because you don't want to get stuck in, we're always either reciprocally narrowing or reciprocally opening. You don't want to get stuck in that. That's definitely not the case.
Right. So that's really good. And that's like the doldrums, like when you're just stuck, like that's like death at sea. If you're in the doldrums, there's no wind and you can't move anywhere. So in the Bible, there's three wisdom books. There's actually four, but there's three. So there's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and then the fourth one is Song of Songs. If you want to make it a wisdom book, and they kind of work. It's interesting how they work. So Proverbs starts out with sort of like some speeches of a father to a son. So this is kind of the setup of Proverbs, and it's just proverbial wisdom from the ages that has proved to be helpful for people to live basically a good life that enables you to do right to others, but also enables you to flourish as well. So this would be like it'd be as simple, and a lot of them are just like do good and good things will come to you. Do evil and evil will come to you. And this is what you can sort of call a reciprocal, or what it I'm blanking on the word, but it's kind of transactional, but it's kind of just how the world works. Like,
Right.
Get a job, do good at your job, serve your boss well, and you'll get promoted, and save your money, and when hard times come, you'll have enough to get through. And it's like all this stuff, but it also has stuff relating to like how to be in good relationship with God, how to be in good relationship with each other and parents, and to the king, and to other stuff. And there's also sort of there's a more mystical aspect of Proverbs where it talks about wisdom being the feminine. There's a poem in there, or I don't know if it's a poem, but a story about how she goes out into the streets and is calling for people to follow her and stuff like that. So this is like the book of Proverbs. It's like good stuff from a father to a son. Live your life this way.
Right.
And this seems to be sort of like this is wisdom. I think this is the kind of wisdom that when Vervaeke's talking about wisdom, he's talking about this stuff. Like, how do you not get stuck? How do you keep moving forward? How do you move in the right direction? How do you do these things?
Mm-hmm.
So that's wisdom. Okay, then we have Ecclesiastes. Now Ecclesiastes just comes in and is like a wrecking ball to this. And it's like, I don't know if when you do good things will happen. Seems like time and chance happen to everyone. There's a season. Right. There's a season for peace. There's a season for war. There's a season to plant. There's a season to pluck that which has been planted. There's a season for healing. There's a season for war. There's a season for healing. Like, it just is sort of like, you may do the right thing, but you just may be in the season of war.
Right.
And just wait it out. There'll be a season of healing later, and then wait it out. There'll be another season of this kind
right. Well, one way to sort of think about that is Proverbs are sort of local in time and space. We'll say general rules that if you follow them throughout your life, right, they will benefit you. Whereas Ecclesiastes seems to be that longer term cyclical thing.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's like, okay, over time, you're following these cycles, and they're sort of coming back and forth and around, and you have to be mindful of those because they're going to break, in some sense, the smaller frame, at least in that frame, right, in that time frame, or in that locality. But on average, everything will be fine.
Yeah, and it's interesting because both Ecclesiastes and Proverbs basically sum up. They're like, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so for Proverbs, fear the Lord, obey his commands, do what's right, and he will bless you. And then in Ecclesiastes, it's sort of like a little bit more like mysterious, like things happen. Like, fear the Lord, trust in him, and I forget how it ends. but it's sort of like the best thing you can do is to do good and to enjoy your life while you have it. That's kind of like the
Right.
concluding statement of Ecclesiastes, is like, why do
Mhm.
evil? It is almost like Peterson's whole line is like, don't make things worse, make things
Right.
better, and enjoy the things that you can when you can, and be grateful for them. This is
Right. Right. That's Stoicism and Epicureanism to
mm-hmm,
some extent, by the way, too. Like that they're right on that.
mm-hmm,
But also, like, I think it's sort of worth noting, and I don't know how accurate it is. I didn't do the research myself, but actually somebody was telling me, it's probably Manuel, that fear can be translated as respect.
mm,
And the thing about fear or respect, because in this context are actually interchangeable when you're speaking of, we'll say, the highest ineffable thing, right, or a creator or something.
right,
Uh, the force as the ethereal force as that created all of the material. Another way to think about it,
mm,
came down to create material. All right. Either way, having the humility to be open to that informing you is the beginning of wisdom. Absolutely, wisdom has to come from outside.
right,
So yes, I'm a big yes on all of that.
right. Okay, so we have these two sort of visions of wisdom from Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and it seems to mostly apply to wisdom that we can have, which includes like a humility and knowing the things that we don't know, like Socrates, like you mentioned. So it includes the things we do know, like do right, do good, enjoy the things, be grateful, but know that time and chance happen to us all. That these kind of things. So that brings us to the book of Job, which then sort of presents even further problems. So it problematizes this even more. So basically, the whole setup is that Job is a good man, and he's basically doing everything in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. This is he is doing all the Vervaeke practices. He's enabling the flourishing of his community. He is wildly successful because he's doing the right things. He's very pragmatic. He's very he's very much humble. He's not arrogant. He doesn't stretch himself too far, nor does he hold himself back. He's exactly sort of right in all these respects. And also he notices that we sin. He makes sacrifices for his children, just in the chance that they have sinned in their heart and he doesn't know it. And so this is how he continually lives. And it seems like he's sort of reached a level where his life has manifested all the things that wisdom can afford you. And then this is just like the first part of chapter 1. And then God says to Satan, so God is like having his heavenly host meeting as they're running. This is a hierarchy. God's delegating to angels and subjugated spirits that do his work in the earth. And then Satan is also there for some reason, and which just means the accuser. It's almost like a public it's the one that would bring up problems to the king and be like,
Right.
King, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. And he has the permission to do that because he's given the title of accuser. So
Right.
he accuses that there's some sort of corruption. He's like, so Job has done all these things. He's a righteous and blameless man, and you've blessed him because of it. But it's not, he doesn't do it for you. He does it as a benefit to himself. And if you take it all away, he will just curse you and expose the corruption that's there. So he makes this accusation that there's this hidden corruption. And without telling the whole story, anyway, the disasters come. He loses all of his children, his wealth. He's inflicted with a skin disease. His wife who is still alive, ends up tempting him to curse God, and he doesn't do it. So his friends come to comfort him, and they sit in silence for 7 days, but this is too much for Job to bear, and he basically cries out, and he says, "Why was I even born?" So what has happened is the worldview that Job had has now absolutely it has crumbled. He doesn't say, "Oh, I wish things were like they were before and not like they are now." He says it's all meaningless. I don't understand why I was even born. And I want to be uncreated. I want to go back to the day when I was born and I want to go straight from the womb to the grave, is what he says. So he's despairing of his own existence. Anyway, this is where Job's at. So the question then begins to be formed is not what is the wisdom that I should have, but Job asks the question is what is the wisdom of God that would enable all this to happen? And I think most of us in life get to that point at some point where we're like, what is the point of all this? What are you doing, God? Then you're asking a question of what is God's wisdom? Mm-hmm. What are the things that he's using to decide what to do and what not to do in the world? And really, it gets down to where this question of being, like, why did you choose me to exist?
Yep. Right.
Because it seems like it's that none of it makes any sense. So
that's the domicide.
Yeah. Right. And so this is the question I want to propose to you. And I would, if I ever met Vervaeke, I would ask him about this, because this seems to be like you've done all the practices. You've enabled connectedness. You've ameliorated foolishness to the best of your ability. You're just a human. And then something like this happens, and you have to ask the question, why?
Why? Right.
And it's not just the question of Ecclesiastes where it's like, oh, just things happen, and sort of it's even deeper than that, because Job knows that God did this to him because of the sequence of events that happen. It's not just time and chance that happens like in Ecclesiastes, where there's these patterns that roll through and whatever. It specifically targeted Job and specifically decimated him in every single way, so that he doesn't have a choice but to view this as God's hand, we'll say. And his friends that gather around him see it the same way, and they just say to him, well, you must have done something really bad. Because obviously the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished, and it looks like you're being punished, therefore we can kind of infer that you have been wicked. But as the reader, you kind of get the inside scoop from the beginning, from the narrator, that says Job was righteous and blameless. And this is even the reason why God points him out to Satan in the very beginning. Not because he's wicked, but actually because he's righteous, he gets chosen. And so we're into this weird world now where Pajot talks about the flip, when things flip upside down for a while. And now we're in upside down world, where the righteous are suffering and the wicked are prospering. I wonder what you think about any of that.
Let me take that. So I want to add some context, and maybe this context is wrong, and you can feel free to correct me or interrupt me at any time. But because again, we have talked about this before, and with other people too. But you're definitely the best for this stuff. Part of the message there is The flourishing is what causes the worship. Right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the bad. Oh, that's the flourishing that causes the worship, not you.
Mm-hmm.
You're not doing it. It's not the highest.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's this direct linear relationship between doing good and getting good. That's the thesis that's laid down by the accuser, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to make an additional proposal, which is, and I don't know, maybe I got this from somewhere, or maybe it's just a thing that I suspect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think also it's not accuser, it's opposer.
Oh, okay.
And this is where the opponent thing that I'm just actually raving mad about, like angry. Like we got to stop that.
The what?
Opposition opponent processing. This is insane.
Okay.
Manuel recently did a talk with Gage Murphy on his channel on agapic orientation, which I'll link here, about opposites. And Gage was saying, "Oh, the whole world is opposites." It's like this. I'm in the other camp. I don't think opposites exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
So well, that's a little. I mean, we can't be further apart in some sense.
You could be opposite.
But we're not either, right? Because I have hope
Right.
and he can't. This
Right.
is with opposition, there is no hope. Sorry.
Hmm.
That's the right. And then they go, well, that's what resolves it. And I'm like, that you didn't resolve anything. You said that's how the world lays itself out, and that can't be true.
Hmm.
Otherwise, there's no way out of it. This is what everybody misses, right? And so if the opposer says, this linear direct causality thing is the only reason why they are looking up effectively, or considering you, maybe they're not even looking up, they're looking this way, and they see this direct relationship, and so they're like, oh, it must be a good God up there somewhere. A good God, as opposed to Gnosticism, right? So, this all seems connected somehow. So he takes the flourishing away, right? And has an effect on pretty much everybody else, unfortunately. But not Job. Job is like, and he doesn't, and I think this is an important point. He doesn't go into make it right. He goes into just take me off the board, like take me out, like make it so that this didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
Which is very different, to your excellent point, than saying, oh no, I want it fixed. Right. Because I want it fixed is like you owe me, or there's an obligation, or he's too humble for that.
He actually does that.
He says he wants it fixed at some point.
So this is the progression. His first reaction is to say, "I wish I was never born."
Right.
Then his friend Eliphaz comes back and tells him this terrible dream, and basically says you should seek God and repent, because He's very kind and will forgive you, and He will restore you back even more than you had before. But you have to repent, and this is the sticking point. So in order to sort of take his friend's advice and repent, he would have to lie. He would have to fabricate something, because he doesn't think he's done anything wrong. Not that he hasn't sinned ever, but he's done nothing wrong to deserve this. So he does take his friend's advice to seek God. So he first calls out to God to like, why was I ever born? But now he calls out to God, and what he imagines in his mind is the city gate, which is where all the men would come to sort out their problems. And he even recounts this scene where he's kind of reminiscing of the old days, but he kind of shows this. It's a wonderful scene where he's not only reminiscing of the old days, but he's showing how this thing would work. So the young men and the princes and the rulers in the area would gather at the gate, and they would be talking and hashing things out. And Job talks about how he would approach them, and everyone would sort of hush. They would like put their hand over their mouth, not because they were fearful of him, but because they wanted to hear what he had to say about whatever matter was at hand. And Job says how he would say words to them, and the words were like the latter rains in the summertime, and that would give rain on the land that needed land. That's how he describes his words to them. And so Job is a man of wisdom, that like Solomon or someone that is able to go in, and everyone's problems kind of are ameliorated, and they're
Right.
able to go out and continue life. Whatever conflict was happening there, Job was able to solve in his wisdom.
With
And then,
propositions.
with what?
Propositions. With words.
Maybe. Well, so then he laments, and he says, "Now I'm a laughing stock. Now they're making fun of me. Now even the lowest slaves are singing songs about me and jeering me and all this stuff." And so there's this contrast of how things were before and how things are now. But that scene at the gate becomes something important for Job, because he's like, he thinks of the arbiter, he thinks of a mediator, and he thinks of a redeemer.
Right.
So the arbiter would be one to make a decision that both parties agree to obey. The mediator would be that one which would help two parties agree to come to an agreement themselves. And the redeemer would be someone that would come in that would pay a price to satisfy, some sort of demand by one of the parties. So he has these sort of three ideas that sort of come up haphazardly, and he's sort of like, there is no arbiter to help me between me and God.
Right.
But then later on he says there is a mediator that could possibly help me out. And then he's also like, I know that my Redeemer will come and not forget my suffering, but be able to pay whatever price it is to God, or whatever
Right.
it is. So he has this idea, but the whole idea is that, God, I need you to come down to the gate so that we can talk this out face to face.
Right.
And this become like,
Right.
Job like builds into this. And so by the end, he lays out basically an argument of all the things I didn't do. He's like, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. And he's like, come and make your accusation against me, so at least
Right.
I'll know. And he says, if you make your accusation, I'll wear it like a crown. He's like, if I
Right.
know what I did wrong, it will be my pride and joy that
Right.
at
Right.
least I'll have an answer. And
Well, but let me just hold
go
you up
ahead.
right there. So one of the things I was gonna, the last point I was gonna make was the following, because I made it earlier, right? But now now I have your expertise to help back it up. There's the things that you know, right? Job knows what he did, and he knows what he didn't do,
Right.
right? And he is wise in that, right? It's not all of wisdom, just no more partial definitions, right? Little pieces, right? And in an opponent world where there's only, in a binary world, same thing, where there's only two things, that's all there is, right? Also, you would have two options of the three that you listed, right? One would be arbitration, the other would be mediation. There's a third option, redemption, which is someone comes down from above and maybe gives both parties or just one party, whatever, sacrifices from the above to give them what they need to be satisfied below. That's condescension, by the way, not a negative. Can be, but is not by default a negative. Usually a positive when the highest comes down to kind of greet you. That's a nice thing for them to do. They don't have to. It might be a little grateful, and that goes back to these three sorts of knowings, right? There's things that you can know. There's things that you do know, right? And okay, there's some overlap there. Like I do know some bunch of stuff, right? But then there's a bunch of unknowns. Good, right? That's the gap between can and do. We're okay with that, right? But then there's the famous, some people are going to get political with this, unknown unknowns.
Oh yeah, the famous
And
unknowns.
this is going to be my argument, is that in the beginning of the story, they show you there's things that are known, there's things that are unknown, and there's things that you cannot know. And at the end of the story, they're going to show you the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you continue from there and tell us the end of the story that exemplifies the unknown unknowns?
No, that's good. But not to take too far of a side thing, but I always liked Zizek always pointed out, like when Donald Rumsfeld went through the categories, there's like the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And he's like, there's a fourth quadrant there that he doesn't mention, which is the unknown knowns, which are the things you know that you don't know you know. And then he's like, that's where ideology lives. And he makes his
I wouldn't frame it that way, but I know
it's
the
the
trickster
assumptions
stuff.
that you make that you don't know that you know. But so anyway, like Job is calling for God to meet him, and he also is lamenting the fact that God hasn't come and met him yet. So he's sort of like, how could I, he both says, like, how could I, a man, speak face to face with him? Like there's no possible way. And then another time he'll say, like, I demand it. Like this is what has to happen. And his friends, sort of just, he sort of progresses from the beginning of his speeches to the end, where he's talking mostly to the friends at the beginning and kind of pleading with them, and then once they're kind of shown to be kind of unhelpful, because their basic stance is in just sort of a doctrine of retribution. Do good, good things will happen. Do evil, evil will happen. And they just sort of interpolate, Job's circumstance, and they keep telling him to repent, and he refuses to repent. So as far as they're concerned, Job is sort of proving himself to be evil, but he becomes more and more sort of confident in what his argument, and so they just sort of stop talking, and Job makes his sort of final argument. In the story, this young man named Elihu ends up coming in after Job makes his last speech, and Elihu makes the longest speech of the book. It's like 6 chapters long or something stupid, and he's this young man he's pissed that the friends weren't able to like silence Job, and they saw how Job made this argument toward God and demanding that God speak to him face to face, and Elihu can't handle it. And so Elihu's an interesting character because you'll find people across the board that either agree or disagree with him. I think Elihu's wrong, but I've had tons of people say that, oh, what he's saying is new and right. It doesn't matter. Anyway, but God comes in to answer Job. And what he answers with are not propositions. So basically he takes up, it's interesting because God Chesterton points this out, that God is very humble. He comes like just blazing in this whirlwind. So in one sense, God is just absolutely an overwhelming force, not to be reckoned with. And you kind of feel sorry for Job that God's like lashing out at him. But there's another way in which God is meeting Job at the gate. Like he's responded to Job's call. And so you're left between these two things. Like God's come in this overwhelming force to kind of, some people think that God's like belittling Job. That's how it reads when you first read it. You're like, man, God's kind of a jerk. But he's actually responded, and he's meeting Job face to face. And how do you want to meet God? What is it like to meet God? And so in Job, it's this whirlwind, and basically God, he invites Job to come to the limits of his thinking. So he first says, do you know about the foundations of the world? Do you know where the pillars of the earth are sunk and what they're laid upon? And so you just sort of like what are the founding principles and what's underneath that? Like we still haven't, in modern science, we haven't figured those things out. Like we get down to to the quarks and the leptons or whatever they're called, and we don't know how to make sense of it. We don't know where the foundation is. and this is sort of so God brings him to the limit of his own sort of rational ability to measure and quantify what he knows in the created world. And then, well, there's a lot of things God does in his speech. I mean, it's this layered poetry, but just to connect it to what we were talking about, he can't explain to Job what he's done. And not because Job is too stupid or that people are dumb, but that it's the whole thing is just too much. It's just too much. It's everything. So it's like asking for God to just tell me everything. And he's like, look outside, there it is. I don't know how to, I can't explain it. It can't be simplified. It just is. And so this is the answer God gives. And he gives Job sort of a tour of creation. But in this tour of creation, he's sort of offering proofs of his work. So he's like, so you imagine you're like, I don't like what God has done. And God comes back. He's like, so you don't like what I've done? All right, look at all my work and you judge. So, he just goes through all kinds of stuff from the mountain goats to the wild donkeys to the ostrich, who apparently doesn't have wisdom and is stupid. And God even points this out. And he talks about, God says, her creator didn't give her much wisdom. And you're like, God, that was you that didn't give her much wisdom. Why are you talking about yourself in the third person like this? And so he goes all the way to Leviathan, the most fearsome and insane beast that sort of is the ancient equivalent of a chaos monster that lives at the bottom of reality itself. It's the Ouroboros. It's the thing that sort of lurks in every childhood fear and horror, that's always in the dark and that's always ready there to sort of take and destroy. And God is like, I even made that. And so God's not offering like any sort of pat answers here, but what he's doing is he's like, look at my work, look at all of creation, and he's sort of like saying, what do you think about this, Job? And right. Job responds to God as the men in the gate responded to Job. So even if God's speech doesn't make sense to us, which it doesn't because it's insane, what we know is that Job understands something, and he's actually comforted. And he right. says, I'm comforted in dust and ashes. I talked about things I didn't know about. And
right.
And this is Job's transformation. And so yeah, do you want to respond to any of that?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there.
No, it's crazy.
Right, but the transformation doesn't seem to occur as a result of propositions or what we might call philosophy in, we'll say, recent times. It comes as a result of an experience. Now, that experience, you could argue, is just merely a vision or something, if you want to say visions are merely, which I don't recommend, because if you had them, you wouldn't think that. Believe me. That transformation comes as the result of an interaction, a participation, an experience with the highest. And it can't be, we'll say, communicated in propositions, and it can't be recommunicated from Job to anyone else. It's only for him. It doesn't need to be for anyone else. Because the exemplification of him being comforted in his experience, this might be something missing from the world, is the role that he plays. It's not to relay, oh, God builds stuff you can't even understand. Because that's the way we think. Like this is the way humans think. Like, knowledge is what I call age of gnosis on Twitter. I'm sure you've seen my age of gnosis
Right.
quotes.
Yeah.
Right. We want the knowledge of like why this happened. Oh, okay. Well, and then science has a definite why for all the things. It doesn't have any whys at all. There's a definite why in science. Well, because the two atoms knocked into one another. Like, why the two atoms knock into one another? Why are there atoms? Why are they moving? Why are they moving in such a... Oh, you didn't answer any why questions. You just pretended you did. Right. And instead of the humility of we can't understand creation, not we don't, but we could if we were educated, not we don't, but for the experience, we will. We cannot ever understand creation. It predates us, right? We are smaller than it. It's kind of where we live. So it's like, hint, that means you're smaller than it. It encompasses you. You do not encompass it. While your knowledge, however you want to define knowledge, I like Vervaeke's 4 Ps, except he's wrong, so you have to fix him. See my video, knowledge engine model. Your knowledge cannot encompass it. And it can't communicate it. You can't use your knowledge and propositions to communicate it either. But it's there, and if you had an encounter with it like Job did, you would be content no matter what happened to you.
Right.
That's a message.
Right. Well, are we getting close to what it means to have wisdom?
I think so. I mean,
it seems like well, let me put it this way. So we have our proverbial wisdom, and then we have our Ecclesiastes wisdom that sort of gets just trounced in the book of Job, because the friends sort of argue a little bit from Ecclesiastes, but mostly from Proverbs. Be like, we're holding up tradition. We're telling you what the wise people have told us. We're not making this up on our own. We're trying to help you out, Job. You're refusing. You keep, saying these wild things. It's just, as far as I'm concerned, it's more proof of your wickedness and whatever. Now, what this does, okay, so to Vervaeke's definition, to go all the way back to that, wisdom is to ameliorate foolishness and to enhance connectedness. Now, for the middle part of the book of Job, so Job's connected to God, not a fool in the beginning. He's connected to God, not a fool at the end. In the middle, this upside down phase, he's absolutely a fool. Everyone thinks he's foolish, and he's absolutely disconnected. He talks about how he no one listens to him, no one's comforting him, no one's hearing the words he's saying. His family and friends have abandoned him, and then God himself is hidden. There's a cloud between me and God. I don't have any connectedness. By Vervaeke's definition, Job here in the middle is a fool. And my argument, I guess, would be that in the narrative of Job, and Peugeot talks about this, you have to become the fool if you're undergoing like an actual transformation. Like, you don't get to not be a fool at some point. It's not we shouldn't, it's like, all right, let's just be a fool all the time then. No, like, don't be an idiot. But this happens like with so many characters in the Bible. Like this is King David becomes a fool. At one point, like as he's exiled, he pretends to be a madman. He's drooling on his beard and he's like acting crazy because he doesn't want to basically entertain this foreign king's alliance. And this king's like, hey, David's been exiled. Maybe I can make a pact with him or whatever. And David just comes and is acting like he's gone nuts. And in some ways, David actually goes a little crazy at different points. And you're just like, why would God do that? But David is like a transformational figure for Israel, as well as he's undergoing a transformation himself, going from being the shepherd boy with a heart after God to being the king. And then you St. Paul talks about this in reference to Christ. Christ is foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling stone for the Jews. And so by this is my bone to pick with Vervaeke, is that you can't just say foolishness is the opposite of wisdom, because God will make a fool out of you in order to do something in the world, it seems.
Right. Well, right. And this goes back to what I said in the beginning. Like, this wisdom thing is some magical silver bullet to solve a problem. Who's in the wisdom camp again? Oh, Peterson. He's a what? A scientist and a researcher and academic. And Vervaeke, he's a what? A scientist. Mm-hmm. I see a pattern. This is all about navigating patterns, in case you didn't know, Jess.
Right.
So there's, and my thesis was and remains, they're trying to get out of logic, reason, rationality, which are trapped. They're stuck. They're framed, much like the frame I'm in, right? And then they can't move. Right? There's no room for potential or miracle in logic, reason, rationality with full certainty. That's what they give you. They give you 100% certainty. That isn't the world we live in. Right, to your point, this is Ecclesiastes. You don't live in that world. Right? Proverbs denies it. Ecclesiastes says no, it's not going to work, because there's these higher patterns. There's patterns above you. Maybe there's things outside of you. You might call that creation. So just pick a random word. Right. And so these two scientists, who I would say are stuck in the scientific frame, right, have a magic bullet called wisdom, which they can't define using logic, reason, and rationality. Fair, I can't either. It's like, I'm good with that part, right? But they're using it to solve a very specific type of a problem. And that type of a problem is a scientific problem, sort of fundamentally, right? It's a problem of science, specifically. And so what ends up happening is they misunderstand, and they want this linear projection of, well, if you have wisdom, you'll do away with foolishness. Notice that's a binary. Those are opposites to him. And your point is, no, the path to wisdom goes through foolishness.
Right.
And the path to wisdom can start at wisdom, go through foolishness, and end in more wisdom. That is correct, by the way, sir. I'm here to tell you.
This is Ian McGilchrist's coincidence of opposites. You know, wisdom and foolishness are actually bound together by a higher wisdom that enables foolishness.
Yeah. This is just everybody getting stuck in the incorrect recapitulation of the dialectic from Hegel.
Right.
Just throw Hegel out. He wasn't a philosopher. He would have punched you if you called him a philosopher. I'm convinced he would have punched you if you called him a philosopher. Being a philosopher was no wonderful title to give somebody back then. Just to let you know, he was a theologian. He was a bad one. Sorry. This dialectic, this two thing, it was never that way in ancient Greece. Sorry. It was never two people. That didn't happen. I'm sorry. And the Greeks were right. Like, Plato's correct. Everybody else is wrong. Plato and Aristotle are probably correct. Everybody else is just wrong after them. Sorry. Heidegger knew it. Nietzsche suspected it but wouldn't admit it. If Heidegger's pretty late on, right? Also, look what happened to him. Maybe don't follow the philosophy of somebody who ends up in the Nazi party. It's a little rule of thumb it's a heuristic I like to follow for some weird reason.
With the Nazis, maybe question it a little bit.
For whatever reason he did it, I don't care. I care that maybe all of his philosophy is bad if it can't get you away from that.
Right.
That's a hand.
Right.
So I don't understand these people following Hegel and Heidegger, and just throw these guys out. You'll be fine. We didn't have them before, and the world still operated just fine. Better, I would argue. And now that we have them, not so good. It could be a coincidence, but I don't think so. Right. And so there's no coincident of opposites. They're just not opposite. Right. Your left and your right brain cooperate to create something bigger than either of those hemispheres could. Well, but it's just cooperation, and they're not opposites. They don't oppose each other in any way, shape, or form. They come up independently with things, and maybe they compete for resource occasionally. And the thing that mediates the competition for resource is the cooperation from above. And that doesn't mean it's perfect, because perfection is not ours, right? It's
Well,
an unknown unknown, right?
in like the structure of Job, it's really interesting. Like the book of Job is all self-contained, so it contains all the. It's sort of self-referential in a very poetic sense. So there's multiple layers and stuff. But one thing you can do is you can compare the beginning and the ending, and the author has specifically laid it out in a certain way. It's actually chiastic in structure, and it starts out with a pattern, and it actually ends with the pattern in the reverse order. So we know there's something going on there that you're supposed to see those, and you're supposed to compare them to, because you have to have some sort of sense of what happened, and why God may have done this. And now it's not an explanation, but what we have are initial conditions and results, and we don't necessarily understand God's the process God goes through to make these decisions or whatever, but we do. But we can see results. So one of the things that results is, oh my gosh, I just went off on something and I can't remember where we were. What were you just? You had.
I was just talking about there's no opposites. It's actually just cooperation.
Oh yeah. One of the things is you start out in the beginning with the opposer, with the accuser, and you end up with Job the mediator.
Right.
The accuser's gone. You have a mediator in the end, and so this is what God accomplishes, and also what was hidden before. So the reason why Satan was able to make the accusation of some sort of corruption on Job's part was because you can't see into someone else's heart and mind. The only way we as the reader are able to is because the narrator just says it, just says he's blameless and righteous. And God vouches for him too. God also says he's blameless and righteous. But if God's in on the game, we don't have to believe God, but we will let's just trust the narrator. And then Job says he's blameless and righteous, but like he could be self-delusional. You don't just believe everyone. So what has to happen is that something that is hidden, Job's blamelessness and righteousness, has to be sort of unveiled, and it's unveiled in this terrible story, but it is nonetheless unveiled because you see at the end everyone realizes Job's righteousness and blamelessness and his role, and they willingly just come to him because they have their own problems with God, and who better to be able to mediate those than to have Job listen to you and mediate those things.
So let me just stop you there for a sec. Right. I want to point out a bunch of patterns. So the Republic is laid out the same way, Plato's Republic.
Oh, is it?
In this chiastic onion. Yeah. It's actually very hard to catch, actually. In fact, I've only gone through it once.
Easy to catch.
No, it's really tough to catch. I've only gone through it once, and thank goodness I didn't try to read it alone, because that would have been a disaster. Read it with a book club. There is a Texas Wisdom Community book club you could read it with virtually, which is not recommended, but it's better than trying to read it on your own, which would be a huge mistake. But because it is laid out in the same way, and I know you struggle with the Book of Job over 150 hours or something ridiculous online with other people, maybe more. Right?
I don't even know. I've lost track.
Yeah, it's a long time, right? Because as one should with these deep texts. But the pattern I want to point out is it seems like opposition, but it doesn't start as opposition and it doesn't end as opposition. So there's the opposition that's in there is for the unveiling or the reconstruction. Now, I want to carry you to a place. I hate doing this.
Just on that point, that's so true, because you read the beginning as an opposer, but after you've finished it and you read the beginning again and you see how God is orchestrating things. And so it's not an opposition anymore. God's sort of like messing, he's using Satan's, let's say Satan has a proclivity to this, and he's using that towards his own purposes. And
so that gets me to the bigger point. And I hate doing this, by the way. This is a big capitulation for me, talking all this stupid Christianese, if you will.
I appreciate you engaging in my world.
I'm glad I'm doing it with you, because you really have this dialed in with all the talks you've done. If you imagine, I don't know, let's pick a cross, just for a random
symbol.
the random symbol, and you lay things out horizontally on the cross, and that's human beings, right? And then you tell a story from a perspective that is above that line, right? We'll just call it the top of the cross randomly, right? But in the story, you have two perspectives on this middle ground, right? So looking down, we're both looking down, right? And the accuser, the opposer, is seeing, well, just linear relationship, right? And that's why he's talking about you. And if that linear relationship wasn't there, he wouldn't bother with you at all. In fact, he'd curse you. And so, and you said this earlier, which is super. This is great. This is fantastic. I really appreciate that you're here doing this, because you're very good at this. What Job sees is that he's righteous. So on this, I'm righteous. What God sees is that Job is righteous in his heart. Okay, and what the accuser, who is maybe he's at the bottom of the cross, he can't see that. Which is why he makes the opposition. Okay. And then I am doing a video on this when I get home. I haven't done it yet. I've got it sort of percolating in my head. The definition of oppose is to set against. And what you probably don't immediately realize about that definition is it's something you do to yourself in relation to the rest of the world. It has nothing to do with the nature of the world. Nothing. You are setting yourself against something. That's something you did. In other words, opposition doesn't exist. It's a state you put yourself in. And it's only ever a state you put yourself in. And that, I think, is what is one of the many messages, because there are many messages in Job, obviously, right? Yeah. That's one of the many messages. But if you look at it from this three perspective, there's a lower perspective, a higher all-knowing perspective, and then there's the perspective that we're afforded, right? And that we can't really get out of in some sense, right? That's why we need faith. We need faith that the higher all-knowing perspective is there, and also we need faith that there is a lower, because you have to either move away from or actively redeem. And I would say all the people in the sort of neutral space is what I would call it. There's a lot of trouble with neutral, especially when you want to think in binaries and opposites. You can't have a neutral. But the neutral space of, we'll say, that the horizontal and a part of the cross is all about redeeming that and making the neutral good, right? And making as much of the things that are lower good too, but like definitely making the neutral good, right? And trying to lift that higher up towards that top of the cross, which we just chose at random, obviously.
Right. No, that's really good. That's good. Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think in the end, Chesterton has this great line. He says in his introduction to the book of Job, where he says, God in his speech is explicit to the point of violence that any of it can be explained. Now he's talking about explanation per se. And he's not saying that, like, oh, there's an explanation, but I'm going to hide it from Job, or there's some sort of explanation out there, but you're so dumb you can't understand it. It's just too big for you. God is explicit about the idea that there is no explanation for his suffering, but God turns everything to the good. And so but this is for Chesterton. This is why God comes in such a fury. is in Job and his friends' desire to try to explain anything. And now Job's a little different. He's implying some sort of explanation, but he's also asking God to speak to him. And this is where Job is right, and this might be the only thing that Job is right in, but it's the absolute key to everything that sort of redeems, that shows him as the blameless and righteous person, is because he actually just wants God to answer him about this thing, and he won't be satisfied with anything else.
It's a connection, right? It's a
Yeah.
type of, it's a quality of a connection, or an intimacy is what I would call it. And so
Yep.
he tries to get intimacy with the highest in whatever way he can, right?
Right. And so and God responds to him in the way that, you know, Job could have asked intimacy in a different scenario, which I think is what, you know, we talked about the four wisdom books, Song of Songs, which is more like man and woman intimacy, which we won't talk about because it gets weird fast when you're talking about intimacy with God. but Job says, I want to have this court case, and God gives it to him. God responds to Job how he asks, which is pretty amazing. And I think that's how it is in our life, and that's how it's been for me too, with when it's only happened like a couple times in my life, but it was the most transformative times in my life, when I had to basically either cry out or ask God the thing, and it took forever to figure out what my question was.
Yes.
You know, that took years. Like, I didn't know what I wanted or what my question was, but then when I was able to formulate it, like, God had an answer for me, and it wasn't the answer that I expected. That's how I know it was beyond me, and it was a surprise, and it took me back, and like sort of it was transformative. So I think that's what we have to do, and a lot of times, like, I think the reason why Job suffers is because suffering is the most clearest sort of example of that. When you have a child that's sick, or when you are suffering yourself of, you know, illness or just circumstance or whatever, you have a lot of questions for God about that. And the correct stance is to ask the questions. Well, first figure out what the questions are, and then ask them to him.
Right. Well, that's high contrast. Suffering is high contrast, right? I would say life is struggle. Suffering is inevitable, right? And you can turn struggle into joy or more suffering. But you do that. The world doesn't do that to you. You do that. Job is an example of that, right? Like, he's turning his struggle into as much joy as he can manage, and maybe it's not much joy, right? But and then I like what you said, because this is also something Peterson talks about. I think people miss a lot. You don't know what you're up to. You can't even formulate the question to ask because you don't know what you want, because you don't know what you're up to, right? But then if you have a question and you ask it, it will be answered. Peterson says both of those things, right? And in some ways, those are answers I've never heard from people in the church in general. Like, I'm talking about the body, not just the clergy, the whole thing. Like, you're all kind of missing the mark on that one.
Well, the church is sort of caught up in the early state. Like, when you're a new believer, like, it's very proverbial. Like, here's what Christianity teaches. Here's the practices you should do. You know, take communion, pray, read your Bible. At least in my Protestant world, you know, different traditions have different emphasis and ways they practice stuff. But you know, this was in that Father Maximus conversation with Vervaeke. Like, even Father Maximus, an Orthodox monk, he got through those initial phases. You know, he's doing the practices. He's basically achieved all kinds of spiritual growth that he can point to and say it was real, and that it was but then he plateaued, and he didn't know how to continue.
Right.
And so that was when he was talking about that he, you know, and it was years and years and years where he was almost despairing because he was continuing to do the practices, doing everything right. You know, I'm doing everything up right. I'm doing everything I know to do. I don't know what else to do. And you're just sort of stuck by no fault of his own.
Right.
And he's plateaued, and he notices it, and he's starting to despair, and then he goes and he starts, and his way out was Neoplatonism, and he started studying Neoplatonism. Not that it was an alternate path, but it actually revigorated his own practices and his own readings of the fathers and stuff, and it was that sort of got him, going again. And then I was just like so thankful, and then we get to reap the benefits of his conversation with Vervaeke about that. Like he suffers all this stuff, and I listen to it and I reap benefits from him. And there's a lot of times where this is clear. I think it's clear in the book of Job. Job's suffering was not for Job.
Exactly.
He doesn't come out, he comes out in the end more blessed, we'll say. But the benefit of Job is to us, and even in the story, the benefit is to all the people that gather together in his house at the end.
Right.
So like, we're like, why am I going through this suffering? Why am I going through, like, it's not for you necessarily. It's for someone else.
But that's very much back to Plato's Republic, and in Book 7 in particular, right? No. You're moving towards the good. You're moving towards the good. You move to a way to grab you as the people of the city.
Oh, right.
Basically, they're gods, and drag you down to the bottom on purpose. And again, God kind of checks. He says, "You can't do that, dude. These guys are going to the good. Why would you take them away from that?" And Socrates goes, and again, he said this many times already by Book 7, like, we're doing this for the good of the city, not the good of the individual. Okay? The city's bigger. You have to acquiesce to the city. And
that's great. Is that what the bodhisattvas do? Is that
that's in there too, right? Yeah, suffering.
They give up enlightenment in order to come down and help others. Like it's the same pattern,
right? But in the Western Buddhist tradition, which has nothing to do with Eastern Buddhism whatsoever, by the way, and I'm surprised people like Vervaeke don't know this. They talk to somebody who grew up there. They will tell. They've told me, many of them, this discussion. I read the Bhagavad Gita. I discussed it with people from India.
Yeah,
I've read Confucius, and I've read a bunch of Buddhist texts. I've read all this stuff and talked to people who came from there about it, and they're like, "No, that understanding's wrong. They just, no, that's not correct." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. This is Alan Watts. It's his fault. Blame him." Whatever. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but also could be. All right. That idea that your suffering is not for you, but is for the good of the world, is very much an Eastern thought. Very much. And that's why I get very upset, actually, with John in particular, but everybody who says, "Well, we've got to meet East and West." And I'm like, by chance, on the Vervaeke Discord server, on the Awakening from Meaning Crisis Discord server, we were reading the Tao Te Ching and Ecclesiastes at the same time.
Oh, wow.
We had these two book clubs going on. Okay.
Yeah.
For some of the Tao Te Ching has lots of translations. We were doing I was doing 5. Some people were doing 10 at once.
Oh, man.
Some of the Tao Te Ching translations and the Ecclesiastes translations are almost identical word for word. Why do we need to merge these two things? They're saying the same thing. If you think they're not, that is your deficit. Sorry. I hate to be blunt about it, but also I can't do anything else. Like, they are not different. The way they are expressed might be different, but the exact same patterns. They're making exact same points. And so that very much of this Silk Road nonsense, it's all ahistorical, completely wrong. Unfortunately, Neoplatonism itself, Jess, I hate to break it to you, doesn't exist. If you watch Vervaeke talk to Dr. Lenton Jack on his channel, he's had a couple conversations with him.
Yeah.
Jack kind of puts that to rest, and he's
really?
a PhD in ancient philology. Well, all the things Vervaeke mentions are Platonic, all of them. And I read, I think it was Plotinus. I might be misremembering. I didn't do any research on this. I just ran across it in the course of other research. I think it was Plotinus that I read. Anti-Platonic, like, he denies the forms in an important way. I'm like, well, then he's not Neoplatonic. If you get away from the forms, you're kind of in trouble. And I haven't put out this video yet. I haven't recorded a video yet, but my third video on Plato's Republic is going to be about book 10. And the thing that people don't understand is that if you actually read the Republic, these people who claim to, I have my doubts. I really do. I'm sorry. I got my doubts, because I had the pleasure of reading it with some very intelligent people, and they, really showed me some stuff. It ends with a story, as in there's a double quote at the beginning of the last part of the text, and there's a double quote at the end with no commentary afterwards. It ends with the story of a death and resurrection. Had anybody ever told me that all these decades, a lot of things in the world would have made a lot more sense. But to be fair, I also would have been much more enraged for much longer of my life, because now I'm older. I don't have as much time to be pissed off at everybody for like not mentioning the most important part of Plato's Republic.
Oh man,
it's like this sort of presages another story that comes later. I think, because I haven't read that book. Too hard to remember even.
Well, I think I'm going through Dante's Inferno.
Oh, Bible, that's what it's called.
I'm going through Dante's Inferno, and he talks about the I think it's in there, where he mentions the pagan philosophers and how they prophesied about Christ coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nobody ever mentions that one little. They also don't mention how many times the Plato's Republic explicitly relies on the gods. It's all over the book. It's all over the book. It's not like, oh, it's mentioned 3 or 4 times. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's really mysterious. They hit the end of their logical argument and they go, oh, well, I just have to rely on, this goddess or that god to do this. It's
Yeah.
like, what? Really?
Yeah.
But it's right there in the book. It's unambiguous.
That's
It's hysterical. It's also, the Republic is actually hysterical. Like, it's really laugh out loud funny. It's great. It's great.
I've never read it. I'll have to read it someday.
Read it with a bunch of people. Read it in a book club.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm going through Dante's Inferno and then C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy.
Oh, fun.
Those are good. But
no, that's great.
You said something about I can't remember now. I'm getting at the end of my cognitive abilities.
That's all right, Jess. We can wrap it up whenever you're ready. So
yeah, there was one thing you said. Oh, I mean, we can sort of end on. I mean, Book of Job is a death and resurrection story. Job doesn't actually die, but he has a second life afterwards. Right. And one of the like, as Job sort of wails and flails through his arguments, and like he's very much like not a stoic. Like, if the author of Ecclesiastes is more stoic, and Job, it seems like at the beginning he sort of tries to do this. Like, so after everything's taken, he says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Everything comes and goes. And then when his wife tells him to curse God and die, he says, should we receive good from God and not receive evil? And it seems like he's trying to do that. But after his friends sit with him, like, he just bursts. Like, there's just like, he cannot keep it in. And isn't that just how we are? And and instead of this being a failure of Job's, his friends don't respect him for it. He kind of bemoans himself that he cannot control himself, and that he has to say these things. And because my suffering is so bad, I will not restrain myself. I'll just say these things, and I'll keep going and keep going. He actually makes these discoveries along the way. So like, we already talked about the arbiter, the mediator, the redeemer, that he's like, he's not, obviously he sort of has experience with these in real life at the gate of the city and determining justice between people that are having disagreements. But now he's thinking of them on like a metaphysical level. And doesn't that sort of prefigure something that's going to happen that's very important in Christianity? Right. But then one of the other things he starts to think about is he starts thinking about the resurrection. And it comes in this strange way where he's like, if only I was a tree, because if a tree is cut down, so he's imagining like literally a family tree. All of his sons and daughters are the branches, and basically he's been cut off at the trunk, and the tree's been fallen. And he says, if I were a tree at the scent of water, I could bud again. I could sprout again. I
Right.
could have another shoot. But then he sort of laments the fact that men aren't like that men just go to the grave and that they aren't seen anymore. And this is Job is always doing this sort of, he proposes something in the negative. He's like, it's not the case that man would go down and then come back up again. So there's this
Right.
apophatic idea of the resurrection. But he grounds this in sort of the memory of God. And so he says to God, God, why don't you just hide me in Sheol? So Sheol is the realm of the dead. It's just sort of like the nether realms where nothing's conscious, and that's where you go when you die. And so he's like, just hide me in Sheol, and then when your wrath has passed, remember me.
Okay.
And so then he has Peugeot talks a lot about memory. And, we have this in other biblical stories. We have, like, after the flooding, God remembers Noah. And then we have when Jonah goes into the belly of the fish, Jonah remembers the temple in the belly of the fish. So Job is also making this connection. He's like, even if I go down to Sheol, if God remembers me, I'll be able to be brought forth again. And he says, and then he even sort of waxes poetically on this idea that God really does love me. And if I am gone, eventually he will start to want me around again, because he'll desire the work of his hands, he says. And eventually God will want to bring Job back because he misses him, and so he's presented that. And so at the very end of the story, we have this, so after everyone's gathered into his house, and after Job has made the prayer, and the friends have made the sacrifice because God wasn't happy with the friends, then Job has he gets double what he had before. So he had 1,000 camels before, now he has 2,000. He had 5,000 sheep before, now he has 10,000 sheep, and so on. At the beginning, he has 10 children. At the end, he just has 10 children again. And so you're kind of expecting this doubling of the children. And then the other thing is, at the beginning, he has 7 sons and 3 daughters. And at the end, he has 7 sons and 3 daughters. And you're like, well, why is that? And it seems to be hinting at the idea that God I'm choking up.
Yeah.
God remembers Job's children
Right.
that died in the beginning. So because what are the odds to have, you have kids again and you have 7 sons and 3 daughters again? Like, this would be, imagine that those decades following, like, as he's having children again,
Yeah.
And when the 10th child is born, they're like, that must have been such a relief for Job, because he would have known that God still remembered them.
Remembered him. Yeah. Remembered the old Job. Or the
remembered the other children. So if God remembers them, he hasn't lost them.
Right. Right. Yep.
And so he actually does have 20 children.
Right.
10 that are gone but remembered, and then the 10 that are there. But now Job, he actually has confirmation that God remembers things, and so there's a hope for the resurrection. This is me putting the pieces together. This isn't explicit in the text at all. But once I saw that, I was blown away.
Yeah. No, that's very powerful imagery in particular. So yeah, thanks for that. That must have been hard to get through. It's
Just like,
yeah.
that's one of the hardest questions people have about the text is like, couldn't God have done this without killing the kids? And you're like, I think that's why God refuses to explain anything. To explain
Yep.
away saying that the death of your children is instrumental in some sort of larger plan is just, you can't
Yeah.
do it. Like
Well,
it
you won't,
diminishes their.
yeah, you won't learn. Like
Yeah.
you won't actually learn from that. If somebody gives you an answer, you didn't learn the answer. You need to work for it. And I like what you said, like, no, he has 20 children. It's like, oh, that's correct. It's like he has 20.
Yeah.
Okay, fair. They did get doubled. Um, and yeah, we have a problem with temporality and having mode stuff. To go back to Vervaeke, right? Like Vervaeke talks about having mode all the time, uh, and we have a problem with that. But we shouldn't. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the message. And I think the wisdom, although he starts out with some wisdom, right, and again goes through foolishness and gets more wisdom, we'll say the wisdom comes from the experience. It doesn't come any other way. It doesn't come from the practices directly. It doesn't come from practices indirectly. It comes from the experience. And it's
Mm-hmm.
the experience of what? Well, I would say it's the experience of struggle, right? And maybe suffering, but just struggle will do. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the point of the accuser or opposer in the beginning is this guy hasn't had any struggle, right? Because he's got this linear one-to-one goodness relationship with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's no struggle there. So how do you know without struggle that he wouldn't just curse
Yeah.
you, right? And the wisdom that's brought into the world by Job's suffering, to your excellent earlier point, is for us, right? Not just for Job in the story,
Mm-hmm.
right? But for us, because we get to see that we don't live in opposition, that the accuser, the accusation is incorrect, because there is a third thing, right, above us that we cannot see because we're stuck here and we don't need to see it, right? But we do need to believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's an interesting Jewish midrash about Job that he's there there it's about Pharaoh and Moses. So Pharaoh and Moses are having their face off about the children of Israel. And the midrash says that Pharaoh has three advisors. Balaam, who is, I don't know if you remember the story. It's a strange story that happens towards I think it's the end of Exodus, where this king calls Balaam to come and curse the Israelites as they're wandering in the wilderness. So Balaam gets up there to curse the Israelites, and he can't do it. He actually ends up blessing them. And the king's like, "What are you doing?" And asks him to curse them again, and he gets up to curse them, and he can't do it, and he blesses them. And it's this weird thing, and Balaam's sort of like this sort of wizardy guy or something, like a cultist. So Balaam's one of them. Then I believe it's either Aaron or Moses' father-in-law. We'll just say Aaron was the other. No, it's not. It's Aaron's father or Moses' father-in-law. What's his name? So like Moses left Egypt when he was a young man, and then he married this woman out in I can't remember the names of anything. It's in Midian or something. And so his father-in-law is like a priest out there, and so he was another advisor. But then Job's the third advisor. So you have these three advisors, and this is kind of how it goes. The one side's with Moses, the other side's with the Pharaoh, that's Balaam, and then the other one, Job, sort of recuses himself. He leaves because he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be in the conflict. He can't decide either Pharaoh or Moses, and so, and this is my own sort of imagining about it. So like Job is hearing news about what happens in the aftermath. Egypt is decimated with plagues and and the death of the firstborn. All the Israelites leave, sort of hurting the economy, and they're just in shambles. And then the Israelites go off and they wander in the desert, and what do out there? They just suffer and complain, and it's a mess. And so Job, in his resolve, says, I will find a path that doesn't involve suffering. I don't want to be like Pharaoh, and I don't want to
Mm.
follow Israel, and they're in both ways are sort of like foolishness. This is
With struggle.
yeah, and so you can sort of read that into the beginning of Job is he's found wisdom, and he's trying to find the way where you don't have to suffer, or you take on the appropriate amount of suffering so you don't have to suffer so much, because he doesn't want to suffer what the Israelites do in the wilderness, and he doesn't want to suffer how the Egyptians did in their hard-heartedness. And so I'm going to take on the appropriate amount of responsibility. This is very Petersonian. I'm going to do all my practices, and I'll do all my John Vervaeke stuff, and I will not have to either suffer the consequences of being hard-hearted or suffer the consequences of wandering in the desert. And God's answer to that is like, you don't get to.
Right.
You're part of this creation, and you will follow the path of my people, the Israelites. You're going to go through the same thing they did. You're going to go into exile. You're going to wander, and I will give you a promised land too. But
Yeah.
you don't get to volunteer out. But I don't like doing these kind of stories because it puts Job at fault for something. And you're like this was your sin, Job, and now you have to pay for it. And the book is specifically set up to say, like, he has done nothing wrong. And in fact, the reason why he did nothing wrong,
Right.
or because he has done nothing wrong, that's the reason why he's chosen to suffer.
Right. Well, it's an indication of righteousness. I mean, it's one of the things that we've lost in recent times, we'll say, right? The age of gnosis is, well, what's wrong with that person? I mean, this is why people go after successful people. I mean, Joey taught me this, right, on BOM. Some people hate success, and maybe not just yours, but their own. And boy, does that explain a lot of stuff you see in the world with people's behavior. They just don't like success,
Right.
and they get upset about it because maybe they don't have as much as they want. And a lot of people, my mother was saying this decades ago to me. She said, there are some people in this world that don't want what you have, right? They don't want like the same things. Like they don't want the TV, the type of TV that you have. They don't want the type of house that you have. They want your stuff.
They want to take it from you, though.
They want your stuff so that
Right.
you don't have it.
Right.
Even if they also don't have it, by the way.
Right.
So they'll break it when they steal it so that you don't have it.
Right.
And unless you know that, the world looks funny to you because you can't, why would somebody do that? It's like, oh, well, because some people are just spiteful
Mm-hmm.
and resentful. And it's stated, to your point, explicitly, Job is not like that at all, even a little bit. And that is what affords him the wisdom. Because one of the things that kills wisdom for sure is resentment. Like that will destroy your ability to become more wise.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like John's point about wisdom, though. He does say, well, we don't need everybody to become more wise. But we do need more wise people. Which to me goes back to exemplification, which goes back to the proper way of learning things, right? Which is through mimicry and, having things exemplified to you, which I would say is tied up in what I call the recession of the church. I've talked to Paul Vanderklay about this a couple of times on various live streams and recorded videos. Like the church has receded. We don't see what it's doing. We don't even see the beauty anymore. You go to the Catholic Church in Columbia, South Carolina. Actually, we have a basilica somehow in Columbia, South Carolina. The outside of the building, it's a brick building. It looks kind of ordinary. It's not that you can't tell it's a church complex because there's a school there and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of can. Inside, it's gorgeous. I'm like, why can't we see this from the outside? Like the most beautiful church in Columbia, of course, there's a Greek Orthodox church that's absolutely stunningly gorgeous, as all Greek Orthodox churches tend to be. But aside from that, aside from the Orthodox, we'll just leave the Orthodox out of this. It's actually a Baptist church. It has big stained glass windows on the outside. You drive right by it when you go into the city. a certain way. You can't miss it.
Mm.
Uh, the Catholic Church, you couldn't tell unless you've been inside, and then you're like, oh my goodness, this is unbelievable, and they're all like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, this is not good. Like, we need to exemplify the beauty. I mean, even if you just believe beauty will save the world, which I most certainly do not, yeah, like, where's the beauty, guys? And that's why the people who say that tend to be Orthodox, because the Orthodox have the market locked on the beauty thing.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
we can agree on that. Like,
I
they
just went
are
to
full on.
I just went to Greek Fest at the Greek Orthodox Church here and went inside. It's in my neighborhood. It's not too far from here, but went inside and got the tour and stuff, and just the beautiful icons painted everywhere. It was just so gorgeous, so gorgeous. And so they had like a tour, and the priest was up there just telling you about the church, and it was stunning. It was stunning.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in Tarpon Springs for the Symbolic World Summit, see my wrap up. Uh, that we did the church tour there, and it was, yeah, it was quite impressive. I mean, they all are, but like, that one was an
Yeah,
impressive church indeed. They had the whole thing going on, and lot of icons. And I mean, if you go to the cathedral in Washington D.C., which I've been to visit Father Eric down there, I know he's down there again for canon law school. That's pretty impressive too, especially the
yeah.
inside. There's quite a bit of iconography and stuff. But that idea that we sort of have to go from, not even necessarily the beautiful, but like the sort of like, we've got a process going here, right? We're doing a religious thing, but you really need the struggle, right? Or maybe the suffering, but definitely the struggle, in order to engender that wisdom. And so wisdom for me is all wrapped up in the experience. And again, we can have the argument, although I think it's a silly one, about whether or not Job experienced something when God gave him the vision of, hey, did you do all this? Yo,
Mm-hmm.
man, you know about this? Did you see this? Because you weren't
Mm-hmm.
around, but like, I've been busy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I did all this stuff,
I've done a lot of
right?
stuff.
I've done a thing or two in my time, son.
Right.
Yeah, right, right. So, I mean, on that note, like, that's sort of part of what I want to say about wisdom. Wisdom really is in experience. It's in direct experience. You can, to some extent, and I am the biggest fan of practices. You can to some extent set aside the
Mm-hmm.
practices, and realize that wisdom is in the learning that you get in the experience of the world. So, how do you want to wrap this up on your
Well,
end, Jeff?
well, I'll just say, like, from a Christian perspective, like, Christ ends up exemplifying wisdom. So or wisdom ends up becoming a person, and obviously it's a person you experience. It's not, So you have to experience Christ in your life in order to have this experience that Job had, and I think it's interesting because we talked about how Job goes up and down through his emotions, and he builds arguments, and he kind of falls apart, and he talks about things that he doesn't know about, and thinks about things that are beyond him, and he's sort of involved in his imagination, but he's also kind of a realist, and he's like talking about things just as they are and how he's experiencing them, and he's not going to lie, and he's going through a lot, and it's just like up and down and up and down, and you can just sort of get a little bit overwhelmed. You're just like, Job, like, pull yourself together, and eventually he kind of does pull himself together, but anyway, and I like Father Eric talked about this at the Arkansas event, where he was talking about the Psalms as being kind of like, we're given the Psalms in order to give expression to the things we're going through.
Right.
And so there's Psalms of lament, there's Psalms of joy, there's Psalms of anger and hurt, and Psalms of reverence, and all this stuff. But it actually helps us recognize those things inside of us. And then it helps us give words to those expressions. Like, it helps us actually learn about ourselves, and not only that, but give us words to express ourselves when we're sort of lacking them. I think it's the same thing with Job. Job gives you a blueprint for suffering, and
Mhm.
like since I've been going through it in such detail, not only Job but also his friends, like those voices come up in my conversation and in my own head as I'm talking with people about suffering. And so people will say things and I'm like, that sounds a lot like Job. And I'll think things and I'll be like, that sounds a lot like the friends. like I'm thinking like, oh, there's probably something you did wrong there, man. and so it's actually enabled me to like realize these things in actual people's lives as they're going through stuff, and the things they'll talk about. Let's just, if they're being honest, like outside of trying to give the right church answer or whatever, the Sunday school answer. And Job is not going through any specific practices. He's not doing anything liturgical. He doesn't have a guide for him. So he's sort of going through them. But what you see, which is so beautiful, is sort of a guide how a righteous man will plumb the depths and the heights of human experience. And mostly the depths in Job. In the Psalms, you can go for the heights. But like if you thought you've lamented things before, like read Job 3. Like it's brutal. It's so brutal. But Job goes to depths and to lengths that we don't go. In sort of that way, he sort of gives you permission, if you're being honest, to kind of tread those grounds without having to worry about for Christians, sometimes you worry about like, does God want me to say these things? Yeah, God wants you to be honest with him. Like,
Right.
Like don't blaspheme or don't just say whatever, don't say things out of anger, but be completely honest. And so I think that's kind of what Job does. And since it's not like a liturgy, and since it's not like a pattern or whatever, it's basically he's just sort of being human. And so there's something amazingly beautiful about he's just going through human things, being honest about it. And then he also has the societal pressures from his friends and the religious pressures and all that. Like all that is in the conversations and in all that stuff. And he's just going through a human experience. And God in the end says what Job said was right.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's a beautiful redeeming of the human experience through suffering. And like you don't have to have any specific things. You just have to sort of maintain the integrity of your heart and not try to fabricate or manipulate or anything, but just go through it and speak honestly about it. And it's through that God sort of is creating and doing his work, and that at the end you'll kind of it will have been worked for the good. So that's probably how I'll like to end it.
I like that. I want to add a little flavor.
Yeah,
So
go for it.
one of the things I think you're talking about that, and I think Sally Joe will absolutely love, is this level of honesty. I think is wrapped up in what she calls great testimony, right? Like being honest about where you are with your faith, which I can understand why the Baptists wouldn't like that. But yeah, read Job, Baptists. That's my advice. That level of honesty with your struggle, with the fact that you're struggling, because I don't know if you know this, Jess. Some people don't seem to. We're fallen creatures, and we're not perfect.
Right.
I know. Shocking news update. Stop the presses. Redo the front page. And when we're not honest about that fact, right, we lose sight of the path to wisdom, which is to realize we don't know everything, and there are some things we'll never know. Bad news, good news. We don't need to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and there's one sense like we won't ever be able to explain anything, but we'll understand.
Yes.
So there's this, and that's where that sort of like when Job has that deep peace and he's comforted at the end. It's not because he has an answer; it's because he understands what's happening.
Right.
And that's like, I don't know what that is, but those are different levels.
No, they are right. You can get to understanding without going through information and knowledge first, right? Or I would say signals, information, and knowledge. That doesn't. You can bypass all that
Right.
straight to understanding through intimacy or the poetic way of informing the
Yeah.
world, right? And that's what he gets. He gets the solution to the domicide that he talked about early on, like just make me uncreated, right? Like, oh, the solution is the intimacy with God by being honest with God. That's the solution. And so I would cast that, though, because I'm just exposed to a lot of Catholicism, even though I'm not a Catholic or anything. That confession leads to redemption, right? Confession, repentance, redemption. But the redemption has nothing to do with us, earthly folk. We're on this part of the cross. The redemption is all for God. Like, you can't redeem anything. It's
Yeah,
not
it's
your
just the work
job.
he's doing.
Right. And whether or not it will follow from your confession and your repentance is not your business. It's not anybody else's business either.
Yeah.
That's
God's
that's
hands.
left all the way up to the top of the to back to that cross symbol we picked at random. But the other thing I wanted to highlight too was I really like this idea, and I'm totally going to steal it. I'm not going to tell anybody
That's fine.
that it's yours, which is this idea that you go from wisdom through foolishness and back to greater wisdom through the encounter with confession, repentance, and an intimate connection with the highest. That I think is super powerful, right? Because and another point that you made is that you don't need practices, bro. As much as and again, I'm the biggest fan of practices. Like, we did a lot of great
me
work
too.
for a lot of people with practices on the Vervaeke server in particular. Like, a lot of work. You'd be surprised. I mean, we don't really like sit there and we don't have a list of names or anything, but like, a lot of people were really helped by Vervaeke's work. His meditation series in particular, which I would say is the awakening from the meaning crisis, and his awakening from the meaning crisis series is awakening to the meaning crisis. In other words, it tells you about the problem. It doesn't really do anything about it. But the practices, the meditation and the cultivating wisdom course, that actually does address some of it, I think, because it does allow at least an opening for this poetic engagement with the world, which is where intimacy lies. That's why I cast it all as the intimacy crisis. See my most recent video with Catherine. That was part 2. There was part 1. I also talked about intimacy crisis with Andrea with the bangs on her channel. That's one of her more popular videos for somebody without a following. Like, I kind of broke the record on that. Everybody else brought their audience. I didn't bring an audience, especially not back then. I couldn't bring one now, unfortunately, but that's okay. I'm okay. Yeah, I know. It's just like, hey, listen to us. We're smart.
We're saying things too.
Yeah, exactly. We have a voice. But that is the great sort of arrogance of our times. I'm going to start a YouTube channel and I'm going to get 1 billion followers, and and the people who do get them, because there are ways, there are procedures and rituals you can follow to get them. Like, I don't know how on board are those guys, right? And so for me, wisdom is just going through this process and learning about these things and having these experiences with people on their journey to wherever they're going, right? To hopefully to the highest ineffable good or something, and interacting with them in a way we have a quality of a relationship, right? And so one gentleman, who was on the Vervaeke server for a while, was video gaming. Work was terrible. Not it wasn't bad. He was just bored because they weren't giving him things to do, and then he ended up getting a divorce, which that was no good. But now I went to his wedding a few months ago in Texas, and he has a much better life, and his job is the same job. He works for the same place, kind of, and it's just much better. Like, everything's better. And going through that with somebody where they're like, oh yeah, I want a video game, or I want to be on Discord all day. But I am suffering, right?
Yeah.
And until people are honest with themselves about their suffering, to your point, and what they're suffering from or what they're struggling with, they can't get out of it, because you need that contrast. So you need to admit to something higher than you that there's a struggle there, and that it's hard for you, and then you can see yourself better, right? And you get counsel from your friends, and maybe it's wrong counsel even, right? It doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
again, it doesn't matter in some sense. That gives you more contrast. And the more contrast you
Mm-hmm.
have, the better you can see to some extent, as long as it's not single high contrast. All right, it's a contrast from, say, different areas. That's why you need three things. Um, Now all of a sudden you can see, and once you see, you get that contentedness, you get that intimacy of, oh, this is where I am in the world,
Mm-hmm.
this is where I belong in the world. Now I understand what I
Mm-hmm.
need to understand. And Nassim Taleb has this nice quote where he says, I want to live happily in a world I don't understand. um, I like to modify that a bit. I'd like to live contented in a world I don't understand. Happiness is a gift, for which you should be grateful when it comes upon you. But yeah, and I think that's really the key right there. Is,
Mm-hmm.
that's how you gain wisdom. You walk through life with your eyes wide open, and you're listening carefully, right? And you're talking honestly about what happened and what happened from your perspective, because those are two different things, or they can be. And if they're not for you, I suggest you try to make them two different things. Try to separate your description of the
Right.
world from your emotional experience of the world, and talk about both.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and get the feedback from outside, because the wisdom's coming from outside of you. It's not, you're not self-generating it, you're not self-transcending. That doesn't even make any sense. I don't know why anybody says such a crazy thing. It doesn't make any sense at all to self-transcend, right? What's happening is there are forces acting outside of you that are hopefully, if you let them, making you more wise, right? Engendering wisdom, giving you a way to relate to the struggle so that it doesn't become more suffering, but it becomes, if not joyful, at least contentedness.
Sounds great.
All right, Jess, thank you so much for taking the
Dude,
time to do this.
thanks,
And
Mark, for having me.
yeah,
This was
everybody
a
should check out. I know
pleasure.
you mentioned the Arkansas event. That's Convivium. Everyone should check that out. The talks are online. Hopefully, I can link it here. I don't know how many links I have on these silly videos, but you should check that out, because it was a really magical event for us. And I know Jess and I were going to play a horrible trick on everybody, but we didn't get a chance to, because that Catholic priest would not let us get away with a tiny white lie
We're gonna
that
try to lie to everyone.
I still think about it, Jess. I still like, oh,
It was an opportunity missed.
it really was. But no, Jess and I met in person. We had a wonderful time.
Yeah, it was fun.
It was really magical. And to some extent that quality of the relationship led to this conversation. So I'm very
Mm-hmm.
grateful to Ted, because in a way that this conversation might not have happened without that event. And I think more of these conversations are necessary about these sort of deep topics around things like wisdom, because everyone's using the word and no one's taken the time to really circumambulate it and get to know it. So thank you so much, Jess. I really
Thanks, Mark.
appreciate it. Yeah.